first part will be a little bit on what is the framework. The second half will be on what do we do, how do we begin rolling it out at the same time. We're going to start with the Positive Workplace Framework. You'll hear me call it PWF. And when we think about Positive Workplace Framework, we're really looking at what are the ingredients? What does a positive workplace culture look like? And down in the corner of the slide, you're going to see 3 key drivers. And to me, this is what typifies a positive workplace, whether I'm talking at UNB or on any other particular workplace setting. The first one is well-being. The first driver, we talk a lot about certainly the mental health in the workplace, and that's such a key aspect, but how do we promote well-being? So when people go to work, they feel better than not in terms of their own personal well-being. The second one is engagement. We hear the term presenteeism, which in essence means people are there, but not really there, not really connected. They're preoccupied, their thoughts are elsewhere. They're not feeling well and really they may be present, but they're not really engaged. There's not an engagement. So when you think about a positive workplace, it's a place where people feel well. It's a place where people feel engaged. And then also a place where people feel they are performing. And what I mean by that are the words thriving and flourishing. That sense of at work, I am moving, I am growing and developing, I'm part of a team, and it's moving forward in positive directions. And there's a sense of collectivity or team that is thriving together and performing well. So it's really hard to take the notion of well-being and engagement and really consider it apart from what we do at work and the accomplishments we have and how we work. So to me, they're intertwined, and a positive workplace culture, a positive workplace setting, not only fosters well-being and engagement, but it also allows teams to work well together. And you can tell a little bit from my tone that I'm hoping that this session will be part of a proactive measure, a proactive approach, as opposed to something that is reactionary as we go. And I think what we've seen is in this time of COVID, during challenging times, that how we work with one another, how we treat one another, the practices that we use have an impact on well-being, engagement, and team thriving or flourishing. Today, we're going to talk about, I wish we had a full day because we could actually go into all the areas, but today we're going to spend the first portion of our time looking at mental fitness practices, and these are foundational relationship practices. But without further ado, let's continue on. And my first question would be to you, and I wish, I'd love to have breakout rooms where we could actually talk and hear this. But first of all, the first question that comes to mind, what is your rationale? What is our rationale for creating a healthy and effective workplace culture or setting? And, that used to be a question where people would always talk about return on investment. But I'm finding over at least the last 2 decades, there has been a shift that this is something which is so foundational. If people are going to work, if I'm going to choose a workplace to be part of, if I'm going to have other people with me, I want to have a place that is healthy and also that is effective. And what I mean effective is that I feel like we're accomplishing something. We are moving together in the same direction. So those 3 drivers come forward as well-being, engagement, and thriving teams or flourishing teams. And, it's really good when we talk about doing this with the workplace is that we actually encourage our teams to talk about this. What's our rationale? Why do we want to have this? Of course, it's not just about the bottom line, but it's about the relationships and people. And our greatest assets are the people that we have with whom we work, and the importance of fostering well-being, engagement, and thriving. So let's go on. And I put that out there because I wanted you to think for a moment about what is your rationale for having a positive workplace context. Now, some of you may recognize this. If you've done work in the area of HR or well-being or mental health, you may have seen a similar diagram. This particular diagram came off a university website that is actually doing work with Corey Key's model. Now, Corey Key's is one of those, kind of big thinkers. You'll see his name mentioned sometimes as a kind of a seminal point or as a critical point for how we conceptualize mental health or well-being. And typically, when we think about a strategy for workplaces, we have to think in terms of 2 dimensions. Now, you notice on that first dimension, which is the one which goes across, it talks about mental health or illness. And this is the notion that we need to, again, not just come to terms, but recognize that mental health impacts 1 in 5 people, and sometimes more than that. And the notion that we've got to be able to talk about mental health related concerns, have an understanding of those areas that impact all the lives of people with whom we work. And so this dimension, it starts with the absence of mental health concerns. And at the other end, it talks about significant, impactful, and more intensive mental health concerns. And the notion here is that we need to have a level of mental health literacy in our workplaces. We need to understand not necessarily the diagnosis, but we need to understand that people are impacted in terms of their emotions, and there are distressing emotions, and the most common being anxiety and depression, that these things do impact the lives of people, and we need to provide people with support. And that's why we have our EFAP programs. This is why we spend time like with Bell Canada, Let's Talk. This is why we see the Mental Health Commission of Canada, we see the Mental Health Commission of Canada putting such an effort on mental health literacy. And all kinds of really good resources, Changing Minds, Mental Health First Aid. These programs actually allow us to have an understanding of mental health and to provide a level of support to people that they need as we continue to walk with them. And we often talk about a recovery model approach, which means that we walk with people and we listen to them and we support them. So that's one aspect of well-being in the workplace. There's a second dimension that sometimes does not get the same level of attention as mental health literacy. And again, mental health literacy is key, but I'm going to call this one positive mental health literacy. And what I mean is, what are the things that we do in the workplace that produce positive emotion, that actually create not only strength, but vitality? The things that when you go into workplace context and say, you know, boy, I really, I'm enjoying being here. I feel motivated and engaged. And in fact, I feel well as a result of being part of this team. And these are practices that actually are universal, which actually help us not only cope, but they also move us towards growing and thriving and flourishing. And you'll see this one it's called the optimal mental health, or the flourishing dimension. And when I first became aware of Corey Keyes, because I am trained as a clinical psychologist, I'm trained in provision of support. I'm trained in areas of mental health literacy. At the same time, this whole area, which really finds its roots in positive psychology, points us to practices that promote well-being. So there's a proactive and strength-focused aspect here. The positive workplace framework comes out of research based on what are the things we need to do to create an optimal environment where people can flourish. And that means individuals may have distressing emotions, but at the same time, there are practices that would allow us to really create experiences where people encounter situations and relationships and interactions that promote well-being, that promote positive emotion. So today we're going to spend some time looking at those. So in terms of talking about mental health counseling and support, that kind of stuff, we've done a fair amount of work there. Today we're going to look at proactive measures for how we work with one another in creating environments where there's well-being, engagement, and flourishing. And I hope I've clarified that a little bit, because when I look at any mental health strategy in a workplace, I'm looking for two dimensions. How do we support people? How do we do mental health literacy? And the second one is, universally, how do we promote environments where people will feel well, be engaged, and thrive together? And really when we talk about the PWF, or Positive Workplace Framework, we're talking about relationship practices that actually impact these three areas. And no matter what your context, we could be talking about UNB, university, interactions in the classroom or in HR. We could be talking about schools, as in elementary. And in New Brunswick, our Francophone and Anglophone schools are now embarking on the Positive Workplace Framework as practices they want to promote in their among their school teams. Or it could be any workplace, and it also could be within our homes. So when we think about our own relationships we have with our family, these practices, I think also have an application there. So today when we talk about PWF, the essence is going to be on practices that contribute to well-being, engagement, and thriving interactions among people. So relationships, of course, are our core focus. Now, when I go into the literature, go into the research and start looking at, okay, if we believe that our practices, the way that we treat one another actually impacts our well-being and our engagement, then how do we choose those practices? Now it's interesting, DC and Ryan talk about creating environments that are need fulfilling within the environment. When they talk about needs, they talk about psychological well-being needs. DC and Ryan are out of the University of Rochester, New York. That's where they initially began their studies on self-determination theory. And of course, now they're kind of internationally known. And I believe it's Ryan who's now doing a lot of work in Australia. But the notion of psychological well-being needs has set the basis for development of the positive workplace framework. And what we're going to do, if you can picture a pyramid, at the very base are the psychological well-being needs that we have. And DC and Ryan actually not only call them psychological well-being needs, but he calls them motivational needs. And you start seeing this relationship between well-being and motivation and engagement. So hence that connection and setting the conditions for flourishing. So as we look at these needs, we're really saying these are the prerequisite foundational aspects of people's lives that need, in our relationships, that need to be met. And the question is, what practices meet those needs? We're going to look at 3 psychological well-being needs and the practices that we can implement in the workplace. We've called these mental fitness needs because they're kind of at the very base. They give us that sense of psychological well-being to move forward. So to be very pragmatic, we're going to take each of the 3 need areas, and then we are going to talk about the practices that go with each one of those. Okay. Now, the very first need area is the need for relatedness. To me, this is the basic of all the 3 needs. This is kind of the door opening one. This is having a sense of connection with people. And when I think about COVID and some of the impact, COVID has impacted connections. And in some ways, maybe it's even actually encouraged people to reach out to others and maybe create connections. But it's such a basic aspect to know people and see people. And one of the things even in this session is I would love to know everyone that's out there and have an individual conversation with you about the importance of connections. So connections are closeness with our peers, the people with whom we work, and other significant individuals in our life, whether that be within the work context or outside. And when people have that sense of connection or relatedness, they essentially say things like, I belong, I'm part of my workplace community. And I feel included. When we talk about inclusion, this is just kind of, I feel like I'm part. I'm not marginalized. And I feel encouraged by that, and I feel supported by others. That presence of support around you as you go through the day, and you have that sense of wraparound. So the need for relatedness. And how do we do this pragmatically, whether it's online digitally and we're doing a Zoom or Teams meeting, or whether it be in person? And I'd like you to think about this right now. And if it's really interesting, when we've done these workshops in smaller groups, I've often asked people, how do you do this? How do you do connection if this is a basic psychological well-being need? Well, I'm going to give you 3 taglines, or 3 actually descriptions of practices that we actually measure within workplaces to see whether they're embedded. And when you think about a practice, it can be on a surface level. Well, it may not even be used at all, but it may be thought about, but not used. It may be something that happens sometimes, or it may be something that's really how the organization, the team, lives and breathes together. So 3 different taglines for relatedness practices. Okay, so to meet relatedness practices, the first, or to meet relatedness well-being needs, the first practice is welcoming. And this is a notion that when I see people, we have a chance to greet one another. Now this morning was kind of neat to talk to Sheila. I've talked to Sheila for a while, and Mackenzie, who we've not seen in person, but just in back and forth on email. So really nice to be greeted this morning, to be welcomed, to be called by name, to just to have that opportunity to feel welcome. I know I went in. I went in actually to a school setting several months ago. Actually, I have to go back several months ago now, pre-COVID, going back that year and a half or so ago. When I walked in to this building, the bell had rung, and students, of course, were in classes. And I was there. I had a meeting with the principal, or directeur de l'école, and it was kind of a glassed-in meeting area at the front desk. And as I went in, I actually knocked on the window because no one was noticing me, and I scared them. And someone looked up to me and said, "Yes, what do you want?" And I'll be honest with you, I was it kind of hit me, because what do you want? There wasn't a good morning. How are you? It was like, what do you want? And I said, well, I'm here for a meeting with the manager, with the principal, and so the second person looked up and said, well, they're not here right now. And I said, well, what should I do? And I said, could someone maybe just check and see maybe where the person is? And then there was this sigh. And I'll be honest with you, I felt like I was an imposition a little bit. And I thought for a moment, like, I'm just being received. And, you know, I've had the opposite feelings in the past, where when I've walked into a place and I've been greeted, like those people that are in the reception area, what an amazing, important task they have of meeting people. And in fact, we actually did some hiring of a new a person who was going to serve in that role of receiving people. And as we were doing that interview, this is for one of our research initiatives. When we were doing that particular interview, the person said, you know, one thing I don't do is talk too much when I do my job, and I don't. And if people come to me, I will make sure that I'm very curt and short. And so I kind of said, well, actually, we would like to encourage you to feel comfortable in welcoming people and taking the time to acknowledge people, how they like to be called, their name, and so on. And anyway, so welcoming is such a key one. The second one is exchanges, and this is having conversations. This is getting to know people. This means as we come online, we take a time to have an exchange or conversation. You know, how's your week been? What's been going on? Sharing some positive aspects. Some people have begun, you know, their meetings with saying, "Can we talk about one positive thing that's happened over the past week, even, or the past couple of weeks?" And what it does is, when we take the time to have exchanges, it does produce positive emotion. It's a conversation. It doesn't mean we neglect our work, but it means we take time not just to welcome people, but to have an exchange with them. I mean, that's reciprocity. That's attachment. That's connection. And when you think about reciprocity, it is like playing a tennis game. You serve and you return, and that creates a rapport. The last one is check-ins, and check-ins are is that we take time to follow up, especially when we have that kind of inner prompt that says, I wonder how that person's doing. You ever have that and you wonder where it comes from? I think sometimes when we're in a group and we see people, there's an aspect of ourselves that and maybe it's just a relationship capacity, but we have the sense we should connect with someone. I wonder how they're doing. And we do a check-in. Really, really kind of interesting. I was on a call, actually on a team meeting, someone who I haven't talked to a whole lot was on the team meeting with us, and I just had a sense, by maybe it was their quietness, maybe it was the change in nonverbal, I'm not sure, but I said, you know, I wonder how they're doing. And after I got off the digital call or meeting, I actually made a phone call and found their number, called them, and they're out of province. And I said, I just wondered how you were doing. We hadn't talked for a long time. We kind of work in our separate areas, but I just wanted to touch base, wondered how you're doing. And it was interesting because the person said, well, things have not been all that easy, but I really appreciate your calling. It's nice to chat. And, you know, so what ends up happening, that sense of caring, I think, that we do in community, which is really part of generosity, is we have a chance to connect with people. So I really think in terms of that practice, it's something that, again, it's not just one person's role, but it's a collective. So first, well-being need, relatedness. 3 practices, welcoming people, exchanges, and check-ins. Now, this isn't a program, as you can see. These are practices. This is how we work and treat one another. So to me, that's an interesting way to think about it. Sometimes when we think about workplace well-being, we think, oh, what's the program? And I think more in these days, programs begin and end, I think more in terms of practices we want to promote within the workplace. So let me go on to the second one here. And I'm going to kind of watch my time as we go, because I'm cognizant of storytelling and the time it takes. But the second need is the need for competency. So second psychological well-being need. And as we get to know people through relatedness, we get to understand what their strengths are, how they function, what contributions they make. And so the psychological well-being need for competency refers to the need to be valued and to have the opportunity to use our strengths, not just in personal goals, but in our team goals together. And when this need is fulfilled within the workplace, people are, they have a recognition of their strengths and their gifts. And when I think of recognition, I'm thinking more in terms of being valued. And when I use my strengths to meet my goal, I feel a sense of worth and accomplishment. And so what are the practices that actually we can put in place to foster or to meet the psychological well-being need of competency? And I want to look at 3 specific ones here. The first one is valuing strengths. And I want to add something. So if you're taking some notes, you can put down this first practice is valuing strengths. And I wanted to add to this slide through gratitude. And this is taking the time to communicate or convey appreciation, thankfulness for what people do. A lot of the time, and I'm thinking myself as being, have serving in leadership positions, in team lead positions through the years, both in public service and university, is that sometimes, I may help structure plans, but there's a whole host. The team and all their functions are critical for getting things done. Sometimes the feedback doesn't get to them. And I think it's important that as we celebrate and as we recognize people on our teams, is that we convey our gratitude, our thankfulness. It's really interesting. The research on gratitude tells us that it produces positive emotion, not only in the one who receives it, but in the one who sends it. In a preceding course that I had during the last 12 months, I had one particular, and I'll say a challenging interaction with one particular person, and I really said, I'm just going to take time to listen and value what they have to say. And I listened, and I heard, as I listened, I got by kind of the way it was being conveyed, and I started hearing, I think, what they viewed as being important. And I sent a note of appreciation and said, I really appreciate you've taken the time to advocate for a particular position or an ideal or perspective. And I said, and I got back this note from the individual saying, that was the first time they felt they had been validated, that they'd had and it's not necessarily agreeing with all things, but in valuing their perspective. And that led to even some more, I think, transparent sharing. It was kind of amazing. So I think gratitude can have such an impact on people's life, valuing. The second one is engaging people's strengths. Sometimes we go outside of our teams to find areas of expertise when we've got strengths right here that we can engage, and inviting people to utilize their strengths. And it could be just in a simple form of consultation. It could be that it is noticing something, it's affirming a strength in someone, and seeing the potential that lies there. So that's a real key one. And I think utilizing the strengths of our team to the fullest and inviting that participation. The third one is building confidence. Now, building confidence is really having people's back. It is supporting them in moving forward, undertaking new tasks that maybe they haven't done in the past, but with the sense of, okay, you've you've got some strengths that you can apply to a new situation, and we have your back. We're with you, you know, and we can check in, we can support you and so on, but we build people's confidence. Bandura calls this self-efficacy. It's a sense of being valued for our strengths, but it also is developing people's confidence that they can move forward and apply those. And that's a big one. If you don't feel like there's a lot of trust, if you don't feel that people have your back, then chances are you may not venture out. But when people feel a sense of connection, relatedness, and they have a sense of competency because people value their strengths and encourage use of their strengths, we also foster their sense of confidence or self-efficacy to take steps forward. And I think that's such a critical one. Now, let me just talk about what happens sometimes when there is gossip in a workplace. And when I say gossip, when there's conversation that's not constructive, that sometimes, maybe a lot of times, destroys the character of people, and it's done in a public setting, and it's you know, I think when you have that, it destroys this sense of confidence or even the willingness to utilize our strengths or to voice our strengths. And so what we've seen as we've measured competency practices in workplaces, that we've seen is where there is that kind of unconstructive kind of conversation, what we've seen is we've seen lower outcomes or in terms of the use of competency practices. I really do believe when we value people's strengths, when we engage them and we build confidence, what we do is we actually have something which is incompatible with speaking poorly about people. We need to, you know, I don't know, I'm not perfect. I haven't arrived, but I'll tell you, when there's a level of grace given to me, an opportunity for me to use my strengths, there is, you know, it really does create more positive emotion and not only feeling well, but being engaged and being able then to take steps forward in terms of thriving or flourishing. So relatedness, competency. Let's move on to the third one. Now this one is autonomy support, and autonomy support practices. Whoops, let me go back. Sorry, go back to the definition. The need for autonomy support. Now, this is not having your own way, and this is not pandemonium where people just do what they want, but it is the notion that we do have a voice, and that within the scope of what we've been asked to be part of on our team is that we have voice, and we even have a level of choice on how we move within a structure, and the notion here is we're active participants. You know what I mean? It's not just a matter of receiving something and doing something. It is that we have an interaction here where our voice does count and where there are choices that are part of that. And they flow into our daily work plans and activities. And this is where people can honestly say, I am able to participate. I am a participant. And in fact, there are decisions that are relative to what I do that I'm involved with. That are important to me and others. And, you know, I feel a sense of hope because others support me in being an active participant in making choices. This is kind of a really a critical one. And in fact, DC and Ryan, when they talk about the three, they talk about relatedness, competency, but they give quite a bit of attention to autonomy support as being a critical one. And when these are in place, things like marginalization, bullying, and exclusion, you know, those kinds of behaviors are incompatible when we support autonomy support practices in the workplace. And autonomy support are not controlling practices; they're supporting people in terms of autonomy. And I want to give some examples. And so, autonomy support practices, as we talk about these three practices, I'd like to tell you a little story. And some people that have attended sessions I've done probably going to remember this story. You know, it's kind of the law. Anyway, I'll tell you the story. I was on my way to speak at the Wu Center, and I was traveling across this is several years ago, traveling across the bridge in my Ford Escape, which had like 400,000 kilometers on it. And it stopped working, and I coasted just off the bridge. And of course, what had happened, I thought it had broken down, but then I looked down at my gas tank and it was registering empty. And I think in those days, if you have children who drive cars, sometimes they drive on your gas and you forget to fill the gas tank. And that was exactly what happened. So here I am, and I jumped out of the vehicle, And as I got out, I saw a gentleman checking the meters, and he looked over and he said, "Did you run out of gas?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well," he said, "you should put your hood up on your car." And I said, "Well, why would I put my hood up if I'm out of gas?" Well, he said, "If you're from the north side, people know you. At least they'll think you broke down, that you didn't run out of gas." And it took me a while to kind of catch that, but I guess I looked less silly or something if the car broke down, I didn't run out of gas. So it took me a while to catch that one. Anyway, I ran over to the Irving downtown, and I went in and I got an orange canister to put gas in so I could go back and fill up so I can make the conference at the Woo Center. And as I was getting the canister, of course, there was a couple of coffee urns there, and there was a group of gentlemen or people there with white hair like mine at the time who were, I think, probably retired, drinking coffee, having conversations around politics, around all kinds of things. And one of the gentlemen who had a white beard like mine kind of stroked it, and he said, as I had held the orange canister, and I can remember his finger kind of pointing, "Did you run out of gas?" And I said, "Yeah, I did." Well, he said, "You know, I'll give you a valuable piece of advice. Keep your gas tank half full." And I thought, okay. And he said, "I always tell my partner, my spouse, keep your gas tank half full." And you can see on the screen my finger showing up. So, and I thought for a moment, I thought, okay, thank you very much for the advice. And boom, off I went. And I put the gas in the vehicle, and then I jumped in and I said, "Oh, where are my keys?" And I thought, "Oh, I've left my keys back at the Irving." So anyway, so I jump and I run on foot, take my canister, go back. I go into the Irving, and the gentleman sees me coming on foot. The same kind of group, the same circle of wisdom, and as I put the canister back, started looking around. The gentleman stroked his beard and he said, "Did you lose your keys?" And I said, "Well, I think they're here someplace." "Well," he said, "you know what? Do you see what I've got on my belt?" And he had one of these silver things that has I guess, a little metal spring on it that keeps his keys on. So I thought, he said, "You know what? I've had this for 20 years, and you need to get one too. You should have one of those things in your belt, and then you'll never lose your keys. They're always with you." I paused for a moment, keep the gas tank half full. Make sure you get one of those squishy things, whatever they are. Make sure you get one of those. And so I smiled and I ran back. And by the way, he asked me, he did tell me, he says, probably what you've done is you've, because your hands were full, you were trying to open the canister, the cap to put the gas in, you probably put your keys on top of the vehicle. And I said, "I'll check." And he was right, I was wrong. And on we came back. Anyway, so as I came back, things happen in threes. I came in, and of course I forgot my wallet to pay for the gas. And of course there was never leave your wallet on the seat of the car when you go in. Take it with you so you can pay for things. Keep your gas tank half full. Get one of those things on your belt so you don't lose your keys. Okay. I don't know, but have you ever used that kind of the finger pointing, telling maybe your children, maybe a spouse, maybe friends, giving good advice? Well, the one thing we know from the research is that telling only approaches don't elicit behavior change. Controlling approaches don't contribute to well-being. Autonomy support, though, does contribute to well-being. It contributes specifically to motivation and engagement. So this is where autonomy support needs to foster a voice, even when there's challenges. I remember a gentleman actually who worked for a power company, and he was a plant manager, and he actually, he said, when I do my rounds and I talk to people, he said, I've changed my approach from being less telling, less controlling, to be more supportive in my interactions. He said, for example, as I would come by someone, maybe a journeyman who was younger than me working on something, I used to say, there's a mistake there, move aside, and then I would fix it. So a completely controlling approach. He said, what I've done in future, knowing the importance of autonomy support, is I first come alongside and I connect and I call them by name. How was your weekend? What's your week? So does a little bit of relatedness practices, and then says, tell me what you're working on. Share with me your voice. And then he affirms, he values, some of the strengths. This looks really good. So this is valuing people's strengths through gratitude. Good job. Recognition. And then when he sees something that needs attention, he said, here's an area that we need maybe to consider working on. What are your thoughts? So inviting people to build solutions together versus telling. Now, there are times, I suppose, when we need to be, when we're talking about specific things where safety is involved, there's a direct, where we need to be more direct, and there's a certain protocol to follow. But most oftentimes, our approach can be less controlling and can be more autonomy supportive in terms of encouraging voice, choice. And of course, voice is first is hearing people. Choice is allowing people to be part of setting the direction. That could be for how they're going to do their work. It could be also building solutions when there's challenges, but also collaboration. And when it's modeled, people do this with one another. When we come together as a team, people have a chance to hear one another and have a level of support and listening. I know there's some groups actually. I'm part of a team building strategy in mental health in British Columbia, and we're going to be doing some team meetings there. And they're going to be looking at processes and policies and how they put them into place. And the teams are going to be engaged together in not only connecting, knowing one another, utilizing their strengths, but also in terms of working at what processes, at mapping the processes together. Kind of excited about, because I've seen that work before and seeing how it builds teams. There are some workplaces that actually on a weekly basis, they bring people together in a meeting. They check in on how things are going. If there's challenges, they work together to develop solutions. So this notion of collaboration, and again, this takes the development of trust over time. It doesn't happen immediately as we move through. So right now, and if you take anything from the session today, the foundational relationship needs and practices focus on relatedness, competency, and autonomy support. And I'm just going to go really, really quickly back. Relatedness, welcoming people, conversations and exchanges and check-ins. Competency practices, valuing strengths through gratitude, engaging strengths, and building confidence, incompatible with gossip or those conversations that really don't support people. Autonomy support practices, incompatible with marginalization, incompatible with bullying in the workplace, because people need to be heard. So having time for voice, where we hear people, choice, and inviting their contributions together, so that these practices are done together in terms of collaboration. Now, I want to talk a little bit, and again, I'm going to look at time here before we go. This is good. I think we're right on schedule. So when we think about practices, they don't all happen at one time. I could say on Monday morning, if I was working for a team, I could send out and say, by the way, everyone, starting Monday morning, following this memo, we are going to implement practices related to relatedness, competency, and autonomy support. So everyone get on board. Like it just doesn't happen in that way. It takes time to implement practices. I'll tell you a story a little bit about this. Actually happened in one workplace. We had a gentleman who attended one of our sessions on mental fitness needs, on psychological well-being needs and practices, and said, I want that for my workplace. And I really like the autonomy support. I want people to engage with me and talk with me, because usually it's just been kind of a one-way approach in the workplace. So this manager sent out an email to everyone, inviting them on Monday during lunch hour to bring their lunch, and that they could discuss where they're going in the future, what were their new projects and plans, how did they like to move forward. And he was really looking forward to having people show up. Well, when Monday came for the meeting, again, it was kind of voluntary, put out there. No one showed up. And it was kind of interesting, because you have a level of discouragement. The intent is good, but no one came. And again, called us and said, well, what am I to do? No one came. Is it because people aren't interested? And when you ask people to share their voice, there is it is important. The notion of trust comes into it, a psychologically safe environment. In other words, we're building relationships. It takes time. as we move through. So we talked to him and said, what if you started, you talk about wanting to use these practices, why don't you start modeling some of them? For example, relatedness would be the first one, which is welcoming, exchanges and check-ins. Why don't you start with relatedness? And in the morning, why don't you start to do some rounds, okay? And what I mean rounds is visiting different aspects of the business, of the team, what they're working on, drop in and have a connection. Anyway, so the next week he decided he'd begin himself to model, right? And to go out. So he went out and he visited some of the different team offices or activities that were ongoing. And people said, of course, the first reaction when you do something different is people say, what's going on, right? So the first week or two, people saying, oh, there's going to be layoffs. There's going to be, there's going to be something's going on because so-and-so who doesn't usually visit is touching base with us. So there was a little bit of, I think, anxiety goes up because there was a change. But this went on for a couple of weeks. And after a while, they said, he must be going through a transition time or some midlife crisis because he's never been this friendly to come and to connect, so the sense of relatedness to check in. So once they get past that, okay, so several weeks in, there was a sense of almost comfort with it. And people started, connecting. So that relatedness started happening among team members. And in part because he opened the door. He had a chance to be generous to others. And that Christmas, he decided to write handwritten Christmas notes to each of the team members, wishing them good holidays or what have you. And he got invited to whatever the Christmas party was that particular year. So it was kind of neat because here was a beginning of development of relatedness. And as we look at relatedness, competency, and autonomy support, what we've noticed as we've measured in the workplace is that relatedness, if you don't have relatedness, you don't have competency or autonomy support practices. Relatedness, that initial connection is critical. Otherwise, we don't see use of competency or autonomy support practices in the workplace. Got really interesting, which gives the sense of that it takes time to build, to enhance, to optimize our workplace community. So if we were really targeted on these practices, it would mean that we need to have not just an intentional plan, but we need to provide sufficient time in order to see changes. It's not a matter of saying we implement the program and it's going to happen on Monday, but it takes time. What you see on the screen in front of you is a process. This comes from Prochaska. It's just kind of it's kind of a generic stages of change, whether it would be within an individual or an organization. So there's a notion of pre-awareness. If we talk about workplace practices, are people really aware of the practices? And then the sense of it, contemplation. When they start thinking about practices that may make a difference in the workplace, have they thought about the reasons for that first question? What would be a rationale for implementing positive workplace practices? And then do we develop plans? And we roll those out so they become expanded? Do we promote people? Do we train people? Do we give them resources to do this? And then, of course, does it become wide in the organization? In other words, something that we do across the organization, like a full organizational approach? And do we embed the practices? Do they become part of our processes? So when we talk about our team meetings, when we talk about the way we do supervisory relationships, when we talk about new employee orientations, are these practices embedded? Is the notion of connection, relatedness, of competency, of valuing people's strengths, and listening and hearing their voice, are those specific aspects of our human interactions embedded in our vision, our aspirations, in our values that we have within the organization? You can collapse these 6 different, we call them stages of change, into actually zones, and be intentful about it if you wanted to do this. So promoting awareness of practices, building practices, and then, of course, embedding practices within the workplace. And the essence is, what are we creating? Are we committed to creating? And what's interesting, if we look at the practices of relatedness, competency, and autonomy support in the literature, we start seeing that they have connections with creating environments where well-being, engagement, and thriving or flourishing take place. And so to me, if we've got practices that actually are foundational to our psychological well-being need, why not introduce them into the workplace content in an intentional way. Now, positive workplace practices, beginning with those foundational ones, is a process that does not happen overnight when we talk about the process of embedding such practices. Typically, we need to have a full organizational approach. We need to have senior leadership. We need grassroots. We need to have people on the same page, moving together. And again, what we've seen in the literature, when you look around some of the evaluation that looks at mental health promotion, positive mental health promotion, they often talk about moving beyond a single year. So financial year, academic year, depending on where your year begins and ends, but moving beyond a full year where we work together and we roll out practices. And we do this, we do this not just after 1 year, but we push beyond 1 year and even move up to 3 years. And I often think in my mind's eye, if I was to shift an organization, I would want to commit to not just 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, but I want to go beyond a year, maybe into a 18 months to 3 year period where we're going to focus on practices. We're going to measure those practices. And we're not just going to do awareness, promotion. We're going to give people opportunity to build, become proficient, and also to embed those practices so people know where in the processes of the day-to-day, because not a program, but they know in terms of the day-to-day where they would implement those practices. As we come kind of the closure to this first section here, when I first started looking at DC and Ryan at those 3 psychological well-being needs and the practices that could go with those taglines, I thought it reminded me a little bit of some of the work by Martin Brokenleg and Brentro, who work in indigenous communities and in residential treatment settings. They utilize the circle of courage, and it has 4 components. It has 3 that look very much. They talk about belongingness instead of relatedness. They talk about mastery instead of competency. They talk about independence versus autonomy support. But then you got this 4th quadrant, which is called generosity, which is the notion that you give to others without necessarily always receiving something in return. So the sense of this unconditional caring that's conveyed through our relationships. And when I think about relatedness practices, welcoming exchanges, check-ins, when I think about competency practices, valuing strengths through gratitude, engaging strengths and building confidence. When I think about autonomy support, voice, choice, and collaboration. When I think about those practices, I think in terms of generosity. How do we give those away to others? Autonomy support. How do I give away listening to people where they really feel heard? How do I give away welcoming, where I greet people with the name and with the way they would like to be referred to? How do I begin utilizing those practices? That is generosity. And it's really not just one person, but it's each person's opportunity. I often think sometimes we require people to do things. I think we should challenge people to aspire to practices that promote positive mental health, positive emotions, well-being, engagement, and thriving within their teams. But first of all, we need to clarify. We need that awareness, promotion piece. We need to give people opportunity to try them on. And then we need to look at embedding those practices. So positive workplace practice series. So this is the follow-up PowerPoint. You'll see the same 3. How do I describe a positive workplace culture? It's one that fosters well-being, engagement of people, and then thriving even during challenging times. And so how do we measure and build? So I'm going to move on to the first slide. Now this one is kind of a summary slide for the main practices that we use to engage culture. So you can see the mental fitness. We did those together, mental fitness practices. We did the sense of relatedness, competency, autonomy, support. The tagline words were welcome, exchanges, check-ins. And by the way, if you get a chance to look at the resource website, which I'll make available to folks after the session, you're going to see example strategies with each of these taglines. Competency, recognizing strengths through gratitude, or valuing strengths through gratitude, using strengths, building confidence. Autonomy support, voice, choice, and then of course collaboration. So these are the foundational ones. If you could turn this sideways, the screen, it would almost look like one on top of the other in a pyramid. And some of you that have worked in HR or in any helping professions are probably familiar with the pyramid of interventions. And this is a notion that there are times when we need to step up the intensity of our practices. And what that means is there's times when if we're working as a team or as a community and we hit a time like COVID, we're going to need to pull together and step up together and support one another during those times. So at the foundation of our pyramid, foundational are our relationships and the practices we use. And these need to be embedded, or I'm suggesting that they be embedded in our practices, that we measure these, that we promote them, and kind of that once a month aspect on our teams. Now, if you were to step up during a time of and when do you step up your practices? When do you increase the level of intensity? You do so during times of change, transition, or challenge. Now, I don't know about you, but the three of the above describe a little bit of what, as in terms of the university context, faculty of education, and even even in terms of research group, we've had to shift and change. We've had to step up because it's been a time of challenge, a time of transition and change. And so if you think of the foundation of the mental fitness practice, when we step up during these times, I'm going to refer to those as resiliency practices. What are the practices as a community that allow us not just to bounce back, which would be kind of your normal definition for resiliency, I bounce back, but allow us to actually receive adversity in a way that we can actually not only learn lessons, but we can actually pull together and be more intentional about how we move through gaining strength, but also developing in new ways. And we know that during times of challenge that, again, we learn more about ourselves. It's been an amazing time. With COVID, people have often asked, and in fact, I was asked to speak not long ago. People said, "Well, what's been the impact of COVID?" It's had lots of ill effects on people, another layer of stress, and it's also brought out some amazing things in people as well. So there's those two sides as we move through. So resiliency practices, what are the practices there? And I'm going to touch on these very quickly. As I mentioned, I'd love to have another hour where we would just focus on these. So stepping up from relatedness, competency, autonomy, support practices, what are some resiliency assets? And when I say assets, what are some resiliency strengths that we can apply as a team? Under relationship assets, we talk about social support, coming around people, that wraparound. It's not just doing check-ins with relatedness, but it's actually stepping up to provide support to people. And this is where we see caring attitudes and social support. This is it was really interesting. This had to do with our faith community, but we in this came kind of via the university. We have a couple we got to know that had two new babies, kind of premature. They were at the IWK for a bit, and the faith community wrapped around and brought them some food, some gifts, some beds, some car seats, and there was this sense of social support. And then on Zoom, we had kind of a collective celebration of a shower for these two new wonderful young children. And when you're a newcomer and you're away, and then you have a community around you that just steps up with you during a difficult time. One thing to have COVID, another thing to have illness within family and health concerns. And then suddenly there's this, alongside, there's a group of people who say, we will step up and go with you on this journey. So that's relationship assets, conveying caring support, social support in tangible ways as we move forward. So this can be also within a work community. Professional assets is knowing that when we hit new challenges and points of transition, that sometimes there are gaps in knowledge. There's opportunities to actually equip people, provide training. Sometimes when we think of hard times, we pull back on all professional learning. This is where we need to accentuate, provide opportunities for people to learn and to learn in diverse ways. And this is where there's also mentorship. We've had this year, my colleagues is on sabbatical. We have a number of different vacancy spots. There are new instructors. There's people that are coming in, and and you're adapting to this time of transition. And so, one of the most wonderful things that I've seen is among faculty members, and especially my colleague Patty, is what has been shared to equip, to mentor, to support others. And this idea of mentorship, how do we support one another? It's not a matter, I keep my own resources, but the notion of creating an environment in which we foster learning, provide opportunity for learning, advocate for it, but also ourselves become mentors to one another, come alongside, provide resources, don't get in the way, but support people as they learn, and encourage them. And you kind of see, when you look at relationship assets, that social support, it's kind of a step up for relatedness. When you think about professional assets, it's kind of stepping up from not only recognizing strengths, but now fostering people. And again, it flows into building their confidence as well. Attitudinal assets, that's a really interesting one. This one has to do with having a positive disposition, and also being able to identify goodness and even strength when there are lots of challenges. And that sometimes can be more difficult. This is not that you have to be positive on all fronts. That's not the intent here. That's not genuine. That's not real. When we talk about attitudinal assets, we're talking about that within the situation, when we have people that we're working with, there are still points of strength and things that we need to recognize. I don't know about you, but I keep a file of emails, feedback that I've received from students, from colleagues, when things have, when some really good things, and I guess maybe when people express gratitude, and I keep them because when I read them, I have a sense that there's still hope. Sometimes the day seems quite overwhelming, but yet when I reflect on some of these blessings or goodness, I suddenly realize, okay, this is my point. This is where I'm going to tie my anchor in terms of a positive disposition. And today, as I go into my team meeting, I'm going to see how I will move with kindness with people, and how I will create hope as I move forward. So my disposition does count. And sometimes I need to check myself as I move through that. And sometimes I need to have some side conversations with trusted colleagues, so that I have a chance to, get off my chest some things may be of concern for me, in order to reframe. And I'll be honest with you, when you think of some of our therapeutic strategies that we do in counseling, are reframing. Here we have a chance to reframe so we don't forget that there are still good things and positive things and value in people as we move forward. Emotional intelligence is choosing how we communicate with others. It is being aware of our own emotions. It's also conveying empathy towards others. And this one is a tough one because in the workplace, as we've measured these practices, emotional intelligence assets have sometimes been an area that have been harder. So it's understanding our own emotions, checking them ourselves. This is a good training for leaders. That's why in our positive leadership section, we do some targeted training on emotional intelligence and positive communication. And that's a critical one. So paying attention. I don't know, in our research group, we've often said, give yourself the 24-hour rule before you respond with an email. And I think we've all had those experiences where we receive an email that maybe has not been that positive, and we need to take time. And I find myself, after I've had some sleep, I sometimes read the same note and take something different away in terms of the emotions have calmed a bit, and now I'm ready to respond. And sometimes the email is not the way to go. Sometimes it's the verbal, it's the opportunity to connect, whether it be online or even if it's in an office situation, to make a connection. So those emotional intelligence asset skills, those 24-hour rules that allow us to think about how we're going to respond, is a pretty critical one. Adaptation assets is actually putting an emphasis on proactive planning. If your team is going through a time of change or transition, it's actually saying, okay, we can be intentional about this. What specific practices are we going to put in place? What processes are we going to put in place? What feedback are we going to have from people? So let's bring our team together. This is autonomy support built into our process of planning, how we're going to cope and how we're going to adapt. So this is when autonomy support really becomes part of a process of planning ahead for future, for new initiatives during the time of COVID and beyond. So these different relationship assets, professional assets, attitudinal. One of the activities we do with leaders and with employees is we give a description of each of these different ones, and we ask people to share which ones have you used when you've gone through a time of change and transition. Which ones have been important? And people will say, often will refer to several of them actually in a certain sequence. So as you think about, when you think about resiliency for yourself, I guess the same question, what specific assets have been important for you? Has it been the social support? Has it been learning new skills and having the opportunity for that? Has it been the notion of actually still maintaining a positive disposition? In other words, I'm going to move through this with a positive, because I'm going to recognize some of the strengths that are still, that are there, the good things that are there. Am I also going to choose how I respond? Is the way, am I going to give people during stressful times a little more slack in terms of, when I say that, a little bit more understanding, a little more empathy during those times, because I'm aware that emotions are stressed? And am I going to choose how I communicate? And of course, adaptation assets. Am I going to put in place, if that's my role, put in place the opportunity for teams to plan together how they will cope, how will they adapt, and then check in again with the teams, so that there's a kind of taking the pulse as we move through. So if you put these together, you have a pyramid at the bottom. You have mental fitness practices, which hit psychological well-being needs. Based on those, you step up into resiliency practices during those times of change, transition, and challenge. And again, thinking here in terms of not just individual well-being, but team well-being, where that interaction, how those practices we employ make a difference. Our notion here was just to, as we started looking at well-being, was to say, if there's things we can do in our interactions to create well-being, what will they look like? And is there a literature base? A lot of the literature here comes out of positive psychology. It comes out of work of DC and Ryan, out of Seligman, out of Kim Cameron, who writes a lot on positive leadership, out of Michael Unger, who talks about collective resiliency. So these are not foreign concepts. And you probably, if you're reading in the area of resiliency, saying, okay, I've seen that here, I've seen that there. What we said, can we look at a framework which focuses on practices and see how that moves? So this is kind of the cheat sheet as you go. And then as we go through, and I'm just going to check my time, 11:40, so I'm going to move here. How do we measure? Now, when we first started working on this area, we developed the framework. And actually, back in 2006, the notion of the psychological well-being needs was brought into the wellness department, as was known at that point in time. Department of Wellness, Culture, and Sport was the initial kind of holder of the well-being strategy. And we looked at DC and Ryan. And then we talked about, well, what happens when you hit challenges? And then, of course, the resiliency assets were added to it, almost like a step up in terms of the pyramid. And then as we started sharing, promoting, training, we said, we got to be able to measure these practices. Can we actually do this? So around 2013, we actually started to do some item analysis, started to build the constructs, and actually developed an instrument called the Mental Fitness Resiliency Inventory. And simply stated, because it's mental fitness, and it measures practices. Because sometimes when we measure workplace practices, we're measuring, we're looking at instruments that use I feel, and so people communicate their emotions on different things, which is sometimes people don't like to do, or it seems to be a little bit intrusive. But here we're asking people to observe in your workplace. Do you see welcoming? Do you see exchanges? Do you see emotional intelligence practices? Do you see relationship support practices in terms of those assets? So we're asking people to be observers. And it's kind of nice because everyone who's there has a chance to feed in, and then we get a chance to see where things are. So more than a feeling, how do we measure changes? Mental Fitness Resiliency Inventory looks at those 8 practice domains. 3 of them are your core relationship mental fitness practices. 5 of them are resiliency. We do it via online. And we report in terms of stages of change. And what I mean is, to what extent are the practices at an awareness level, at a building level, or at an embedded level? Are they how we live and breathe? And we do that by asking people to say, does this look a lot like your workplace, somewhat like your workplace, or very much like your workplace? In other words, we see it day to day. When you say very much, is something that we see on an ongoing basis. If you don't see it at all, then it's probably at an awareness level. If you see it kind of in the middle, you're probably seeing examples of it, but it's moving forward. And wouldn't it be neat to give to an organization, if we know these practices contribute to those three drivers: well-being, engagement, and thriving in terms of our teams, wouldn't it be neat then to be able to provide feedback saying, here are strengths, here are areas that that may need to have some work. We published actually in 2020 in an international journal. You'll see it on the page, in HR journal, and again, it's an International Journal of Work Health Management, and we were really pleased as we worked through that and actually did all of the the construct validity, all of the technical aspects, thanks to Robert Laurie and to Viviane from Guatemala, who worked with us, as well as a doctoral student at the university. Again, the mental fitness resiliency inventory uses stages of change, and we do this via an online survey with 32 items. It's a screening. There are 4 items for each particular subscale. So I just wanted to give you a picture of what it might look like pragmatically. So this is a picture taken out of one of our former reports. We've actually changed some of the pictures because people aren't necessarily wearing ties, and it looks a little bit like my 70s hairdo I used to have. Anyway, if you look at this particular graph, what you see is awareness, building, and embedded at the bottom. And then you've got percent of participants, and this is where people have endured the practice. So when you think about relatedness, which is welcoming, exchanges, and check-ins, and you look at this particular organization and you look at awareness building, you see 94% of people saying, we see relatedness practices as being something that is very much like our workplace. So good morning, welcoming, exchanges, conversations, and check-ins. Isn't that great? So, I mean, that's true. It's quite an endorsement when you think about that as you go through. Gives you an idea of the culture of that organization. Now, same organization, we asked about competency practices, valuing in terms of people's strengths through gratitude, engaging people's strengths, and even building confidence. And here what you see is a little different, but you see probably embedded, you see about 55%, so about half, and then you see another 25% or so kind of say we're in a building phase. And then you've got some folks that saying, we really haven't seen those practices. So what it does is it gives you a sense of where we are. And again, organizations can be big. So you can have different groups that have different experiences. You have new employees, you have people who have been there for a while, and it gives you a sense of kind of a pulse. So this would be an area where we're saying, it's kind of building. We're seeing stuff's going on, but we could perhaps put some emphasis there. And same organization, okay? Autonomy support. Now, remember, autonomy support is voice, choice, and collaboration. So this one is kind of going the other direction. Do we have opportunities for voice? Do we have opportunities for choice? Are there exchanges that happen where perspectives are shared in the actual process? And in this organization, it kind of came out saying, no, this is an area for development. And you realize this is not bad or good. This is perspectives collectively being shared. So we have a little bit of a synthesis in terms of where's the distribution, so that you can see the graph going in the other direction. So think about this organization. In this particular place, people have worked together for a long time, probably 100 or so people in the actual organization, filled out the 32 item survey on it. And what they told me, we have good connections. We know each other well. We worked each other well. We check in with one another. And then they talked about their valuing. And valuing through gratitude, engaging strengths. 80% has said, we're either in a building or embedded. So, it was moving well. And then you get to autonomy support and you're saying, where do people have a chance to share voice, to be part, to feel like they're participants in setting directions? And that one was like, that's an area for development. So these are neither good or bad things. These are observations that provide opportunity to promote practices. not bad organizations, but opportunity to actually move forward. So that was kind of an interesting one. And when you think about organizations, it takes time to implement those practices. We talked about kind of that 1 to 3 year period where we promote practices, we train people, we have managers, leaders on board, and we are targeted specifically as we go. Again, this is just kind of the percentages of instead of looking at it in a graph format, and you can see the resiliency ones there are as well. Typically, we like to see at least 70% in the embedded. So if you're in zone C, if you have 70%, we call it embedded. If you have 80% kind of spread between building and embedded, we call that building. And if you have, more than 20%, like 20, 30, 40, 50 in awareness, we say maybe we need to target for promotion. And that's a little bit, I just talked a little bit about the interpretation results. So we produce a graph like this, and it's interesting, this particular organization, they have relatedness, embedded practice. You notice the relationship assets on the resiliency is also embedded, not surprising. The competencies at a building level, so the valuing. And you see down below that professional assets, the training aspect and attitudinal positivity is all building. And then you see areas for development, autonomy support, opportunities to build that in as part of our processes, the way we communicate each other during stressful times, maybe some work there, and adaptation assets, which is actually structuring times where people can be participants in setting plans for moving forward, especially when it talks about coping or we're going through a time of change or transition. Becomes important aspect. So that's kind of kind of an interesting. If I was in the organization, it would give me a sense of where can I begin targeting practices, and also celebrate some of the practices that are built in. Now, the real test becomes when we've taken those practices and we've actually created a well-being index, which goes on an 8-point scale. When we take the synthesis of practices, we say, so where does that fit in terms of kind of a well-being index? Can we actually utilize, and we have used it to look at a well-being index, and you'll see this particular organization that I showed you fits kind of right in the middle. It's in building, which is great, but there's areas to go in terms of overall. And again, moving forward, what we've noticed with Wellbeing Index is that we've seen, we've used that in terms of our research, and what we've seen is over a period of 3 years, we've actually seen enhancement in terms of staff well-being reflected in increased engagement or attendance, in decreased attrition, also even in terms of people meeting goals and productivity. So it's kind of interesting. When we have a well workplace, guess what? Better things happen. And that's both in terms of people feeling engaged, being included, moving forward, as well as in terms of our work. And I think, so we felt pretty good saying, practices are tangible. We've had system level research where we've had 70 organizations over 3 years, and we've actually measured practices in terms of, or looked at data alongside of the practices and the embeddedness of practices, and where we've seen organizations target practices, we've actually seen higher levels of attendance, less attrition, and more productivity. And if you want to get into that, I should have Robert Laurie on our area, because he's done our work. And we've done some of this in the public service, of course, especially through education with among Francophone schools, where we started really, because the Francophone side of the Department of Education actually had uptake there. So we're excited about having that, because we've had a stretch of 6 years working in the public service now, and as we go. So I'm going to move on here. So how do we change workplace? Some really, as we come to close at 11:48, what are steps to changing workplace culture? Well, first of all, is enhance awareness of the value of positive workplace culture and relationship practices. You're going to see less about program, more about practices. And this is awareness. These are your CEOs. These are your middle managers. These are your employees. To have a sense, first of all, to demystify what the practices are. And then to talk about why they're important in terms of well-being, engagement, and thriving, and then to begin, because without that awareness, that engagement, it's going to be hard to move things out. The second one is measure the presence of positive workplace practices, and because that gives you a starting point. Where are your practices? Where are your mental fitness and resilience practices? Are they at a awareness level, a building, or embedded level? promote and build positive workplace practices and daily routines. Now take opportunity now to promote these. And when we talked about the level of implementation, initially at least, once per month provides an opportunity for teams to become acquainted with the practices, begin thinking about how they would use them, and then to actually roll them out. And ideally over 3 years is to see them embedded in terms of processes, and that may be reflected in our values, our orientations, our leadership training, the way we do our team meetings. I want to show you, and I will at the end, I will show you a resource website that we'll make available to folks if they would like to, have a chance to look through some of the resources just to get a better idea of, because when we talk about promoting and building, it's good to train people first how to do it, and then also to have those resources there. Then track, follow up. And again, you can follow up using the MFRI kind of as you kind of key performance indicator, if you do that kind of thing with your organizations. And then of course, as you follow, and it's like taking the pulse a little bit, you target and embed workplaces. You become intentional in the process of change. And I mean, as you look through this, we published a nice article actually in the NBTA, New Brunswick Teacher Association letter with Oromocto High School, because they've been doing this for a number of years, and they've been taking the pulse of, and then of course adjusting. And of course, as an organization, you live a journey. And on that journey, there are times of more stress, there's times of less stress. The question is, are we aware of where we are? Are we aware of what practices we're using? Because we have new team members, we have some that retire. There's a dynamic there where we need to remember the practices that actually create well-being, engagement, and thriving teams as we move forward. So we did talk about the MFRI. Through CEL, there is some training. And there's also self-directed learning modules, which we have on Moodle, which we use for training in mental fitness, resiliency, and positive leadership. And to be honest with you, what we do is when we do in-person training, we often encourage teams, leadership teams, HR teams, and even employee groups to actually utilize the online training. A lot of our organizations have, certificate. You're supposed to each year do so many professional learning hours. So sometimes this feeds in, provides opportunity for that through the asynchronous or Moodle training. And then of course we also have a positive leadership inventory that we've used. I haven't talked about that this time, but that would be. So I'm going to just, question is, will your organization be a positive place? And what are you creating? And when I say let's talk, if some of the things have been helpful today, certainly don't mind in encouraging. I do want to show you one last thing before I turn it back. This actually is the part of the website, resource website that we use. And let me just see, first of all, I want to make sure you can see this. So let me just make sure it's there. There we go. I think you can see it there. This is part of the, make this bigger. So I'll just move my screen around here. This is part of the, when we do training, we actually provide resources. And you'll see this one's mental fitness. You'll notice that there's a home here. There are activities that are here. Let me just get to the mental fitness one here, first of all. There we go, mental fitness. There is activities here which are meant for teams. When we talked about doing something once per month with your team, these are short activities or PDF format that you can use to promote positive workplace practices, focusing on relatedness, competency, autonomy, support. There are also modules which are short videos and ebooks. For example, kind of a review, at least in part of our session today on mental fitness practices is here. So there's a video that you can use. Again, they range from 20 to 40 minutes in length, and there's an ebook that you can also you can download or you can use online that provides the background. Again, they're very the same. Sometimes we use ebooks in our presentation formats. And if you look back through the modules, there's quite understanding, encouraging, engaging others. There's also information on the MFRI there. There's also action plans. So if you wanted to do per month, it gives you an idea of what activity you could do per month. And then finally, for facilitators, there's a quick link to each of the workplaces, but there's also lists of strategies. When we talk about relatedness, what are strategies that you actually could use? So if there is interested in perusing the website or having access to it, I'm not going to send out a joint email to everybody, but if those that are interested, I'd encourage you to follow up, and I will give you access for things. The resiliency one, again, is a little bit same idea. You've got lists of activities that you can use. Again, you've got around resilient teams. There are modules here, and these modules have grown out of our requests. So resiliency practices, which is what I did very quickly, but there's also stuff on effective personal coping, managing change, understanding mental health concerns, work-life balance, positive personal change, strengths of individual differences, diversity, inclusion. So we've included a wider range here based on kind of request, and there are videos and ebooks. And then, of course, information on the MFRI. There's action planning here, which again is kind of a month by month. And although it does it within a 12-month period, this one is probably 18 months. There's too many resources to do within a year format. And then, of course, there is the facilitator section, which not only has quick access to the modules, but also to a PowerPoint if you want to do your own presentations. And then, of course, there are strategies for each of the resiliency assets. There's a dozen of them. So if you count the 8 practice domains, there's 96 strategies kind of individualized if you wanted to choose if your team was working